If you've ever trusted someone so deeply that your world felt safe just because they were standing beside you, then stop scrolling right now and listen carefully, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a psychological lesson about boundaries, betrayal, and quiet power. So before this goes any further, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay till the end, because what unfolds next might completely change how you see relationships forever, especially when love pretends to be honesty but hides manipulation underneath. And it all started the moment my husband looked up from his phone with a casual smile and said, "My ex is coming to Christmas dinner with us," as if he had just told me we were out of milk. And in that exact second my mind didn't explode with anger the way most people expect. Instead it went silent, because silence is often the first psychological response when reality doesn't match the image you've been living in. And I remember the room feeling suddenly colder even though the heater was on, the Christmas lights blinking softly on the wall like they were mocking me. And my first thought wasn't jealousy, it was confusion, because the way he said it wasn't a question. It wasn't a discussion, it was a statement, a decision already made. And psychology teaches us that when someone announces something deeply personal without inviting your emotional response, they are unconsciously signaling control. And I looked at him, searching his face for hesitation, guilt, or even awareness, but what I saw instead was comfort, the comfort of a man who believed he had already trained his partner to accept discomfort quietly. And that realization hurt more than the idea of his ex sitting at our Christmas table, because it told me something far more dangerous was happening beneath the surface, something subtle and slow, something I hadn't named yet. And I asked him calmly, almost gently, why, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to hear how he justified it. And he shrugged and said she was alone this year, that it would be awkward to say no, that Christmas was about kindness. And that line right there is where psychology steps in, because manipulators often disguise boundary violations as moral obligations, making you feel cruel for protecting your emotional space. And as he spoke I noticed how every sentence centered on him, his comfort, his image, his guilt, never once asking how this would make me feel. And I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I was observing. Because when you stop reacting emotionally, people reveal their true patterns. And inside my head I replayed moments I had ignored before. The way he still followed her online, the way her name slipped into conversations like an unfinished thought, the way he dismissed my discomfort as insecurity. And suddenly this wasn't about Christmas dinner at all, it was about power dynamics, about who was expected to swallow discomfort to keep peace, and who never had to. And here's the part most people don't talk about. Psychology says that betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly, sometimes it enters smiling, holding a plate of cookies, calling itself friendship. And I realized he truly believed I would say yes, that I would adjust, that I would perform emotional labor so he wouldn't have to face his past alone. And that belief didn't come from nowhere, it came from patterns I had allowed, from silences I chose instead of conversations, from compromises that slowly turned into expectations. And I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not sadness, but clarity, because clarity is what happens when denial finally lets go. And I smiled back at him, a calm smile that confused him, and I said, "Of course," and that single word made him relax instantly, because people who assume control are never prepared for strategic calm. And that night while he slept peacefully beside me, convinced everything was settled, my mind was wide awake, not planning revenge, not spiraling into fear, but analyzing, because psychology teaches that the most powerful response isn't confrontation, it's preparation. And I thought about Christmas as a symbol, a space meant for safety, warmth, and chosen family, and how he had invited unresolved history into it without consent. And I realized something important, something that viewers listening right now need to understand deeply. When someone prioritizes their past comfort over your present boundaries, they are telling you exactly where you stand. And the mistake most people make is arguing instead of listening, fighting instead of understanding the message, because the message was clear, my feelings were optional. And that realization didn't break me, it grounded me. And over the next few days I watched him closely, how he talked about her with nostalgia masked as neutrality, how he avoided details, how he assumed I wouldn't ask questions. And every observation added another piece to the psychological puzzle, because humans are consistent, they repeat behaviors when they believe there are no consequences. And Christmas morning arrived wrapped in music and forced cheer. And while he busied himself preparing the house, I prepared myself emotionally, not to compete, not to prove worth, but to reclaim agency, because self-respect doesn't announce itself, it operates quietly, and I want you listening to understand this. You don't always need to scream to be strong. Sometimes strength is letting people reveal themselves fully. And when she finally arrived, smiling politely, carrying a gift like a peace offering, I felt an unexpected calm, because by then I had already accepted the truth, not about her, but about him, and acceptance is psychologically freeing, because it removes hope from places where it doesn't belong. And as we sat at the table, his glances, his nervous laughter, his subtle need to manage both worlds at once became obvious, and something fascinating happens in moments like these. The person who thought they held power begins to feel it slipping without understanding why, and that's because power doesn't come from control, it comes from awareness, and mine was growing with every passing minute. And while he thought Christmas dinner would pass like any other awkward compromise, he had no idea what was forming quietly beneath the surface. No idea that this moment wasn't the beginning of a fight, but the beginning of a reckoning, because psychology teaches us that people don't change when they're accused, they change when consequences finally appear. And as the evening went on, I smiled, I listened, I observed. And inside I made a promise to myself that no one else would ever decide my emotional boundaries for me again. And if this story resonates with you even a little, if you've ever been placed in a position where your comfort was treated as negotiable, stay with me, because this is only the beginning, and what came next was something my husband never saw coming, something that would expose truths he had carefully avoided. And before we go any further, remember this: awareness is power, and sometimes the calmest person in the room is the one about to change everything. As the night unfolded and plates were cleared from the table, something subtle but powerful began to happen, something my husband couldn't name but definitely felt, because when people believe they are in control, they expect predictability, and I was no longer predictable, and psychology tells us that unpredictability destabilizes false authority faster than confrontation ever could. And while he laughed a little louder than usual and kept offering drinks that nobody asked for, I noticed the small cracks in his confidence, the way his eyes searched my face after every comment she made, as if silently asking for reassurance that I was still playing the role he had written for me, the understanding wife, the emotionally flexible partner, the one who absorbed discomfort to preserve harmony. And that's when I realized something important that viewers need to understand clearly. Manipulation often relies on unspoken contracts, contracts where one person gives patience, silence, and emotional labor, while the other gives nothing but expectations, and the moment one side stops honoring that contract, the entire structure starts to collapse. And I saw that collapse beginning right in front of me, not dramatically, not explosively, but quietly, because quiet shifts are the most terrifying for people who rely on control. And when she excused herself to use the restroom, the room changed instantly, like the air itself exhaled, and he turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "You're being really cool about this," and that sentence right there deserves attention, because psychology teaches us that when someone praises you for tolerating discomfort they caused, they are revealing entitlement, not gratitude. And instead of responding emotionally, instead of explaining myself or asking for validation, I simply nodded, and that nod confused him more than anger ever would, because it gave him nothing to work with, and people who manipulate emotionally depend on reactions, they need feedback to adjust their behavior, and I was giving him none. And inside my mind I was no longer asking why he invited his ex, I was asking why he believed he could do so without consequences. And that question led me down a path of uncomfortable honesty with myself, because psychology isn't just about analyzing others, it's about recognizing our own patterns. And I had to admit that there were moments in our relationship where I had minimized my needs to avoid conflict, where I had chosen peace over truth, and those choices had slowly taught him that my boundaries were flexible, and that realization wasn't self-blame, it was self-awareness, because awareness allows change. And as the evening continued, I began to speak differently, not more, just differently. My words were measured, confident, clear, and I noticed how both of them reacted, how she leaned back slightly when I spoke, how he interrupted less, because confidence without aggression shifts social dynamics instantly. And then came the moment that changed everything, the moment he truly had no idea was coming, because after dessert, when the conversation drifted toward memories, toward the past, toward stories that didn't include me, I calmly asked a simple question, one that wasn't accusatory, one that didn't carry anger, but carried truth. I asked, "So what exactly went wrong between you two?" And the silence that followed was deafening, because I had just broken an unspoken rule. The rule that the past should be acknowledged only superficially, never examined, and psychology tells us that avoided topics hold the most emotional charge, and his reaction confirmed it. His body tensed, his jaw tightened. His eyes flicked toward her before returning to me, and in that moment I wasn't asking out of jealousy, I was asking out of clarity, because I deserved to understand the emotional history that had been invited into my home, and she answered first, cautiously, choosing her words carefully, while he sat rigid, uncomfortable, because narratives are powerful, and whoever controls the narrative controls perception, and as she spoke, inconsistencies emerged, small ones, subtle ones, but enough for me to see that the story I had been told about their breakup was incomplete, sanitized, designed to protect his image, and that's when the emotional weight of the evening shifted entirely, because now it wasn't about me accepting her presence, it was about him facing the truth he had buried, and psychology teaches us that buried truths don't disappear, they wait, and as the conversation continued, he tried to steer it away, to joke, to deflect, but the damage was already done, because the illusion of control had cracked, and what replaced it was discomfort, his discomfort, the kind he had so easily assigned to me, and I watched him struggle with it, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because this is what happens when emotional labor is returned to its rightful owner, and later that night, after she left, the house felt different, heavier, quieter, and he finally asked the question he had been avoiding all evening, "Are you okay?" And that question might sound caring, but psychology tells us to listen to timing, because concern delayed until convenience is not concern, it's damage control, and I looked at him and said honestly, "I'm clear," and that word unsettled him more than anger ever could, because clarity doesn't invite debate, and that night we didn't argue, we didn't fight, because fights still assume equal investment in saving something, and I was no longer there, emotionally, I was observing, evaluating, deciding, and if you're listening to this and feeling a knot in your chest, it's because you recognize this moment, the moment where love stops being blind and starts being honest, and honesty is terrifying when it reveals imbalance, and as I lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, I understood something profound. Something psychology confirms again and again. People don't fear losing others as much as they fear losing control over how they're perceived, and my husband wasn't afraid of losing me yet, he was afraid of losing the version of himself he had carefully maintained, and that fear would soon push him to reveal even more, because when control slips, people either change or expose themselves, and what happened next would leave no room for denial, not for him, and not for me, and if you think this is where the story peaks, stay with me, because the final shift wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was irreversible. In the days that followed Christmas, something fundamental shifted between us, not in the loud obvious way people expect when relationships crack, but in the quiet psychological way that changes everything permanently, because once clarity enters a space, confusion can never fully return, and my husband began behaving differently, not better, just differently, and psychology explains this pattern clearly. When someone senses they are losing emotional authority, they oscillate between charm and defensiveness, and I watched him do exactly that, one moment overly attentive, offering help he had never offered before, the next moment distant and irritated, as if my calm awareness itself was an accusation. And that's when I realized something deeply important that I want every person listening to understand. When you stop reacting the way someone expects, they are forced to confront themselves, and most people are not prepared for that confrontation. And one evening a few days later, he finally broke the silence, not with an apology, not with accountability, but with justification, explaining again why inviting his ex had made sense, how it wasn't a big deal. And psychology tells us that justification is a defense mechanism used to protect self-image, not to repair harm, and instead of debating facts or emotions, I asked him a question that shifted the entire conversation. I asked, "Why did you assume I would be okay with it?" And that question stopped him cold, because it wasn't about her anymore, it was about entitlement, and he struggled to answer, stumbling through half sentences, because entitlement survives only when it remains unspoken. And in that moment I saw him clearly, not as a villain, not as a monster, but as a man who had grown comfortable placing emotional weight on someone else's shoulders. And clarity doesn't always lead to dramatic endings, sometimes it leads to quiet decisions, and over the following weeks I stopped over-explaining myself, stopped minimizing my needs, stopped absorbing discomfort to keep peace, and psychology shows us that when one person changes their internal rules, The relationship must either evolve or collapse, because it can no longer operate on the same unbalanced system. And he felt that change deeply, questioning me more, probing for reassurance, asking if everything was okay, because when emotional labor is removed, insecurity rises in the person who benefited from it, and one night he finally admitted something he had never said out loud before, that he had assumed I would always adapt, always understand, always forgive, and hearing that wasn't painful, it was freeing, because assumptions lose power once they are spoken. And I told him calmly that adapting without consent isn't love, it's convenience, and that sentence marked the point of no return, because psychology teaches us that once boundaries are named clearly, they cannot be ignored without consequence. And from that moment on, the relationship stood at a crossroads, one path requiring accountability, growth, and discomfort for him, the other requiring nothing but continued emotional withdrawal from me. And here's the part most stories avoid: the ending wasn't explosive. There was no shouting match, no dramatic exit, because real psychological shifts don't need theatrics, they need truth. And whether he chose to change or not became less important than the fact that I no longer needed him to choose correctly for me to feel whole. And that is the most powerful transformation a person can experience, when your sense of self no longer depends on someone else's awareness. And if you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, understand this deeply: boundaries don't push the right people away, they reveal the wrong ones, and clarity isn't cruel, it's kind to your future self. And my husband truly had no idea what was coming next, not because I plotted revenge or delivered ultimatums, but because he never expected me to wake up, and awareness changes everything. So if this story made you pause, if it made you reflect on moments where you stayed quiet to keep peace, I want you to engage right now. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they are mirrors. And the more we talk about emotional boundaries, psychology, and self-respect, the less power silent manipulation has over our lives. And remember this one final truth: the moment you stop shrinking to fit someone else's comfort is the moment your life truly begins.